The My Ford University podcast, episode 20. We're going to do a case study today. We're going to look at population collapse. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I've got something different for you today. It's not a sales pitch. It's not a self-help episode. And it's definitely not a conspiracy podcast. What it is a thinking case study. We did one before on planned obsolescence. We're going to talk about population collapse and some of the ramifications for it. And we're going to use some of the thinking methodologies and looking at it. So if you've been following me lately, you know I've been talking a lot about these things, especially these thinking methodologies, how to apply tools like root cause analysis, systems thinking, inversion, first principles thinking, strategic frameworks to solve real-world problems and uncover what's really going on. Today, I want to walk you through how I personally use these exact tools to reevaluate something I once dismissed, and it led me to a deeper understanding of one of the most important topics of our time: declining population, broken relationships, the rise of childlessness, and the slow unraveling of the social and economic systems we've come to rely upon. So, let's get to it. We'll continue on here. How I got here. So let me give you a little backstory. Years ago, I would talk to people and I'd hear them saying, Social Security is not going to be there for us when we get older. And I'll admit it. I typically laughed it off. I thought it was paranoia. I figured the government would just tweak the math and maybe raise the retirement age and keep it going. But over the last few years, and I talked about this in the last podcast, had to reevaluate and reassess. Over the last few years, I started noticing patterns that didn't sit right. And here are some of them. Marriage rates kept dropping. People weren't forming households. Birth rates were collapsing. And fewer people than ever wanted kids. At first, it just seemed like the modern world was doing its thing. More choice, more freedom, right? Well, I started to reevaluate and reassess, and here's what I was noticing. The patterns wouldn't leave me alone. I started to ask why, my favorite question, as you know, and the more I asked, the more I realized something deeper was going on. This wasn't just a personal preference, it was structural. It was a systematic drift that was in action, and it was accelerating. So I started to think a little deeper about it, and again, I believe in thinking and not reacting. So before we go deeper, I want to make something clear. This isn't a political rant. It isn't a cultural finger pointing. What I'm doing here is demonstrating how to think. If you've ever read the book Freakonomics, you know what I mean. It doesn't just tell you stories. It asks weird, uncomfortable questions like, why do drug dealers live with their moms? And what caused crime to suddenly drop in the 90s? And the answers were never what you expected. In fact, I'm sure some people were upset with the answers. But when you look at the data and you give it an objective perspective, you'd be shocked at the answers. Highly recommend you check that book out. It was about seeing incentives, and it was about asking better questions and following the logic. And that's the spirit that I'm going to bring you today's episode. So, demographics is destiny. If you're not familiar with what demographics are, it's looking at people and characteristics and traits of people. So with that, here's a stat you want to keep in mind, okay? To maintain a stable population, a country needs a fertility rate of about 2.1 children per woman. That's the replacement rate. That 2.1 number is a very important number, okay? Today, there are different numbers bandied about, but the U.S. is at about 1.7 and falling. Japan is at 1.3, and South Korea is falling off the cliff, 0.72, and that's not a typo. So remember, 2.1 is replacement rate. U.S. is at 1.7 and dropping. Japan is at 1.3. And South Korea is at 0.72. This isn't just a trend, it's a ticking time bomb. Think about it. If you're not replacing your population, everything built on growth, everything, you ready? Tax systems, pensions, schools, housing markets, even consumer demand starts to weaken. And that's not something that you can fix overnight. These aren't switches that you can just flip. It takes decades to reverse, if at all. If at all. So let's look at some factors. The dating market is broken. Let's talk about how we got here, okay? Because this just didn't happen all at once. Over time, we've watched the dating turn into something transactional, gamified, and frankly exhausting. Apps commodified people, swipe right, swipe left, you know what I'm talking about. Preferences hardened into deal breakers. The bare minimum expectations got a little bit out of whack. And instead of forming bonds, people formed expectations. And expectations that were ridiculous in some cases, if you take a good hard look at this. So on top of that, there's a growing divide. A small percentage of men get most of the attention. Many women say there are no good men, and many men are opting out of it altogether. They just don't even want to be bothered. So movements like feminism reframed traditional roles, and it wasn't about and didn't look at replacing them with anything cohesive. Meanwhile, many men simply walked away, citing rejection and fear of false allegations or accusations, legal risks, and just sheer exhaustion. This isn't about blaming anyone. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm objectively looking at this. It's about recognizing the core social mechanism, pair bonding, and when it starts to break, the downstream consequences are enormous. Okay? Another factor, delayed or abandoned families. Inversion is a very useful tool here. We've talked about inversion thinking. Okay? If you wanted to stop people from forming families, what would you do? What would you do? Well, you might normalize long academic and career tracks. That's been happening. You might want to make child rearing incredibly expensive. I understand it is out of control. You may want to promote solo lifestyles as aspirational. That's been happening. You might want to demonize traditional values. I think that's been happening. You might want to remove any societal push or incentive to settle down. Everyone wants to live their best life. There's nothing wrong with doing that, but there are consequences, and we're seeing that. You might want to inject fear and distrust into the dating process. And guess what? We're doing all of it. Now people are getting married, now people are getting married, if at all, much later than they did in the past. Kids come later, if they come at all. And some people are actively choosing to be child-free, not out of necessity, but out of preference. This is not evil, it's just a logical outcome of the system's incentives. Everyone is showing you their highlight reels on social media, and there are fallout from this. There are people who make new decisions based on what they're seeing. The system doesn't really care. And the system that we are in and are looking at maintaining will not be maintained because it was built on the idea of growth. So it's not going to survive this new trend. So you may be asking, okay, what happens next? Well, here's the scary part. Most of the economy is built on growth. There was always going to be a larger pool of people behind. Most of our social programs were funded by future workers. That's what I was getting at when I was talking about the Social Security question. And most of our stability depends on shared purpose and intergenerational continuity. But if we're no longer replacing ourselves, well, what happens? Our labor forces shrink, our elderly populations balloon, and tax burdens start to grow. There's cultures fracture, and of course, trust erodes. And none of this um, current political solutions that are being thrown out there are even addressing the core of the issue. And that's where systems thinking comes in. So if we're not dealing with not just dealing with the economics or the culture, and we're dealing with the complex adaptive system, every part of it affects other parts. That's what we learned in systems thinking. So what can we do? Here's the $1,000,000 question. What do we do? And I'll be honest, I don't have a silver bullet. A single answer that solves all the problems is what a silver bullet is, if you haven't heard that expression. But I do know this. You can't fix the problem that you don't understand. And you can't understand it if you're unwilling to think about it. And you can't just react to the headlines. You need to ask why, and you need to invert the assumptions. You need to trace the incentives and connect the systems. So you need to recognize that your old beliefs no longer serve you and be willing to change your mind. Again, I reference you back to the last podcast where we talked about intellectual curiosity and open-mindedness and constantly reassessing your belief systems and things you hold to be true. Always reassess them because things change. And that gets back to my original story. I always used to think people were being ridiculous when they said it. They were saying it for other reasons, but as I've looked at it, it's coming true because there's less workers behind everyone to continue to pay that Social Security. Again, I used to dismiss the idea that systems could fail, but now I know better. All right. This is not as long as the planned obsolescence case study we did, but this at least gets you thinking. And again, I want you to question and explore things. So let me give you some final thoughts. This isn't about fear. It's just about clarity. There are a lot of coincidences out there. Remember, we talked about that. A lot of coincidences that just happen to benefit certain groups. And a lot of contrivances that reshape how we live without asking if it's what we want. And sure, some people might call it collusion, and some might even call it a conspiracy. I don't know that I call it a conspiracy. I just think it was a misplaced idea or a series of ideas that led us to a particular place, but we still have a problem that we need to deal with. But if you step back and you apply the right thinking tools, you start to see the truth. It's a system, and it's behaving exactly as it was designed to behave. It's just not working with what's going on. So let's stop pretending that it's all random and let's start thinking, really thinking about what comes next. All right. That's going to be it for today. I want to thank you for listening. If you want to read the long form article of this, you can find it on myforduniversity.com/blog. You'll find the blog there. If you want to read a shorter form, you can read the newsletter. It's free if you want to join up for that. And if this episode made you think differently, please share it. Don't keep us a secret. That's how we can shift the conversation. So until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep building something worth passing on. This is George Sloan, founder and dean of My Ford University, where you learn it fast and apply it faster. We will see you folks the next time. Thank you.